Hello, Phil. Let's start that again.
We're leaving that in.
We're leaving that in. Yeah.
Hello, folks.
Hello, Phil.
All right, let's cut it.
No. We're not cutting it.
Hello, folks, and welcome to episode 14 of Cookie Pocket, an attempt at a podcast. Today we're going to be talking about Carnival of Souls, a 1962 cult horror film directed by Herk Harvey, in which a young woman is involved in a drag racing car accident, after which she moves to another town and gets a job as a church organist. But she soon starts to see strange visions, including a pale man who seems to be following her about. So let's start, as we always do, with our general impressions. Christian, Mitchell, what'd you think of the movie?
Well, I didn't hate it. I ended up...
That seems to be the standard now for the movies I recommend to you.
Yes.
Dang.
Well, we're trying. I'm trying, at least. I gave it a 2 out of 5, and for me, the positives were the spooky stuff and the pale dude like showing up out of nowhere. Like, that was cool and interesting, but I was generally frustrated by I guess you could say the plot. Like, I didn't really feel like there was much of a plot going on. It just kind of felt like Mary Henry was going through the motions of her life, and there was a spooky thing showing up, and it wasn't really going anywhere for me. I guess for the time period, some of the ideas that they explore are interesting. I guess I just wish that was explored in a more concrete manner. But and the acting is kind of like hammed up a lot in certain spots, but that's sort of to be expected for a 60s movie. But parts of it were entertaining. I liked that it was a shorter film, and I'm not just saying that because I didn't love it, but I actually think it's nice to just like watch an entire film in under 90 minutes. That's not something you can usually do. So I don't know if that necessarily makes it a better film, but it was nice. And I enjoyed parts of it, and I gave it a 2 out of 5.
Okay. Mitchell?
I think the best way to describe this film is that it was ahead of its time.
Yeah.
In a lot of ways. The way that the pacing and kind of the ideas that it proposes and the cinematography is all very like decades ahead. I feel like a lot of movies have very similar influence, even just beyond the 60s, like in the 70s and 80s too. But yeah, there was a lot of ideas in this that I would have not expected at all. Like, I really did not think this was that old, and watching it in black and white didn't really, change any perspective that I could have had if it was in color. But yeah, overall, I really enjoyed a lot of aspects of it, and I was not expecting a lot of it to be frightening, considering how bare bones it was because of the budget. But yeah, I mean, it was very raw. It was a raw horror film, and it took as many steps as it needed to make an audience member feel frightened, even in 2020. So I think that you can give it a lot of credit for that. And even though the acting was definitely overacted, I think even to an extent too much for a movie at that time. I know some of it is a part of how people actually were and how movies were made. But that's my only major criticism, and there's not too much they could have done with that because of the budget. So really, a large majority of the problems that it had could have been fixed with a slightly larger budget, to be honest. But yeah, it was paced very well. The organ music was very well spaced out, played by the protagonist Mary Henry, and also as a score. And it was very ominous, and it matched the scenes perfectly, especially towards the end when it was in the carnival areas. It was playing carnival music, and that's opposed to how she was playing the organ in the church. So yeah, I mean, everything about this is very bare bones, and I think it really did not need to do very much to get horror out there. And I think it did it very well. I think it's definitely one of a kind, definitely of its time film. So I gave it a 3 out of 5 overall.
Yeah, I would agree with a lot of that. I think this is a movie that I really like because as somebody who I make films myself, and I think this movie, like you said, Mitchell, was made on a very low budget, only $33,000, which even back in the 60s was a very, very low budget for a feature film. It was made by a guy who was primarily known for educational and industrial movies. Herk Harvey, the director, made lots of short films for like McGraw-Hill and textbook companies. A lot of the films that our parents probably watched in high school were likely made by Herk Harvey. And this film, I think, shows that even with a tiny budget and little experience, if you've got a big imagination and the willingness to pull through and get things done, you can make a feature film. And I find that really inspiring because I am probably going to also have to jump through those hoops and make those efforts to make a feature film on a very low budget one day. I think there are some really legitimately spooky moments in this. And Christian, in your Twitter review, you seem to suggest that it was a movie very much of its time. I would argue that in a lot of places, this feels like, as Mitchell said, very ahead of its time. In kind of the 50s, 60s, a lot of the time sci-fi and horror were very grounded in that horrific things would happen, but they would be very kind of real and in the moment, and it would be primarily addressing just sort of the physical, practical needs of what's happening to these characters in a horrific situation. This is, I think, one of the first movies that introduced kind of abstract, dreamlike elements to horror, and sort of clarifies that you don't necessarily have to have jumps and monsters that go boogity boogity boo to be like a horror film. And I think that influence can be seen from George Romero later in the 60s to David Lynch in the 70s and 80s. So it's a film I really enjoy. I'm perfectly willing to admit that it's not perfect. There are definitely rough edges from the inexperience of the cast and crew, but I personally give it a 3 out of 5. Now, we have all mentioned the acting, at least to some extent, but I want to talk a little bit further on that. What did you guys think of the performance in this film, specifically that of Candice Hilligoss as Mary Henry, the protagonist?
Well, I quite liked the character of Mary Henry, and I thought that overall she was kind of the bright spot, especially with regard to the acting and the talent. The only bits where she kind of lost me were sometimes at the screaming moments where sometimes it felt like that was cut together a little abruptly, and her face didn't really have the same expression that her exclamations did.
Yeah.
But I that's kind of a minor complaint. Overall, I thought she was very good and definitely the strongest cast member, as she should be, as the protagonist. And I think that if she was not engaging or interesting to me, I may have given this a lower rating. So that was definitely one of the most positive aspects for me.
Okay. Mitchell, what do you think?
Yeah, Hilligoss was by far the best actor or actress in this entire thing. Like Christian had said, some of her moments were not very convincing, especially when she was in the, I guess the in-house or wherever that would be.
Yeah.
And she was like staring at the lock for way too long, for like 4 seconds, and I was like, why is she staring at it for so long? And then she just screams and then locks it. I was like, why didn't you just do that in the first place? So I mean, like Christian had said also, that was a very minor thing. It really did not take me out of the movie, especially because the movie kind of already set itself in your mind as to what it was supposed to be. So you kind of know what it was going for way earlier on than most films, I think. But that wasn't really that big of a deal. Most of the time when she was frightened, I genuinely believed that she was frightened, and I think that was, especially so early in her career, I guess this would be a very good movie to start off on for her. The other actors and actresses were all right. Clearly, they were not very experienced, and they didn't have nearly as much natural ability as her. But I think Herk Harvey as the man was definitely, he didn't really have to do too much.
No.
But in terms of his very minor expressions where he had to express them, I think he did a very good job. And, like I had said, very raw horror. Like, there's really not much that needs to be put together to have a frightening scene. Lyndon was pretty convincing. He wasn't that bad. I don't think he was kind of like not too much, not too little. He did what he was supposed to. Mrs. Thomas was pretty good. She had some really good lines. I think she was written pretty well, but I mean, she was, not too important, I guess. She did what she was supposed to. And then the minister and Dr. Samuels were kind of all right. I think the doctor kind of had some pretty bad sequences, especially the one when he's trying to talk to her. That was probably like the worst acting in the entire film.
He's just like grabbing her arm for like 2 minutes
really
straight
tight too.
upon just meeting
her
her.
Arms being compressed, like let go of her.
And the minister was all right. I think when he was trying to let her go from the church, that was his best moment. But really, she, Hilligoss is the star of the show, and she definitely really showed a lot of potential as an actress in this, so I can definitely appreciate that, and I think she carries the movie pretty hard. So,
yeah, I would definitely agree. Candice Hilligoss is an actor who doesn't really seem to have had much of a career beyond this movie, which is surprising because apparently she was professionally trained in New York. She had a lot behind her. She's probably the most well-known or most certified actress or actor in this movie. But I don't necessarily think she does a great job in this. I think she's kind of wooden and kind of blank for a lot of the time. I think her lines express a lot of emotion, but her face a lot of the time doesn't. But I think this is a role that kind of performance sort of works for, because we learn in the movie that she's sort of always been distant from people. She says at one point that she's never felt a great need to have a connection to people or be close to people. And so I think that sort of airy, distant, kind of 1,000-yard stare type of performance works for that type of character. I do like the performance of the woman that plays Mrs. Thomas. I think she, I think more than anybody else in the movie, gives the impression that that's just her. It doesn't really feel like she's acting. It feels like that's just the woman, and she thought, "Oh, I'd love to be in a movie," and then they put her in the movie. And I think
movie knocked my socks off.
Yeah, I think she's really sweet in the film and really works in that character. I would like to talk a little bit more about the character of Lyndon, because we had a little bit of a dispute before recording about whether or not Lyndon was meant to be a creep, or whether we're meant to see him as, a nice young boy who's trying his best with Mary. Christian, you were kind of the dissenting opinion on this, so would you like to talk a little bit further on your opinion?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. The more I think about it, I guess he's probably supposed to be the creep, and I think that becomes abundantly clear when he takes her out to that wherever they're at to dance, and she's just kind of sitting there, and then he sees one of his buddies. And it's pretty clear that his buddy's also kind of like I see pretty woman, I want pretty woman type person that is not extremely dynamic beyond that desire. So, I mean, it's definitely sort of an archetypal role that's meant to, and I think that character being kind of a creepy jerk helps to communicate how terrified Mary Henry is, because she has no interest in him whatsoever, and then she decides to spend the night with him because of how terrified she is, but she also shows measurable discomfort towards him earlier in the movie. So to the degree at which that device works to develop Mary Henry's emotional place in the film, it makes sense. So I guess I don't have a problem with him being in the movie, but that doesn't mean I have to like his character, and I didn't. I despised him.
Yeah.
I didn't want to mention. I know Zach Zach's probably going to mention this later. The Sixth Sense, okay?
Yes. We will talk about that.
Yes. You know what? I'll save it. I'll save it for you, Zach.
Oh.
But I will say, Mr. Lyndon is definitely way too forward. Everything that he says is purposefully forward, and he's kind of just, want woman, ooga booga, the entire time. And the reason is not necessarily because, Christian kind of touched on this, it's not necessarily because of him, it's because of Mary Henry's world that she's living in. Because the state that she's in for the entire movie, as you find out in the end, is kind of shows that there is no one, purposefully no one to comfort her. Everyone is like purposefully being distant with her as she's being distant with them. Like, she's completely disconnected from everything and everyone in the world.
Mm-hmm.
Even when she tries to be an organ player and she knows she's a professional one, she messes that up too.
Mm-hmm.
And it's all leading back to the carnival, and that's kind of like the whole point. So yeah, Mr. Linden kind of is like a puzzle piece, a part of the rest of what Mary Henry's experiencing, that's both supernatural and also just natural, normal, practical things.
Yeah, I totally agree. I agree, Christian. I don't think you're meant to like Lyndon's character at all. I think you're kind of meant to think he's a bit of a sleaze. But I will say, I think it could have potentially been more interesting to see that character be a nicer guy and be somebody that she might have actually been interested in. Because that way we'd kind of have a contrast with the man, played by Herk Harvey, and we'd have like the predatory man in her life that's following her around and creeping her out, and then we'd have an actual nice guy that she's trying to connect to. And I think to have her not be able to connect to somebody she's actually interested in because of the man's presence could have been kind of an interesting theme. They don't really go anywhere with that, and I think the way that Lyndon is kind of a creep and her feeling uncomfortable around him, both due to her own sort of hallucinations and being forced by them to be around him, somebody that creeps her out anyway. I think that is interesting, but I think it would be sort of been an interesting path to go the other way and see a different side to that character, which we don't in this version of the film, at least.
Mm-hmm. Now that you mentioned
later,
that,
what did you say, Christian?
I was just gonna say, there's actually kind of an interesting, almost feminist perspective you can look at the film with that regard, as like the creepy, monstrous man and Lyndon being like the only two options or prominent men in Mary Henry's life up to this point. And there's this discourse where she's like doesn't have any interest in getting a boyfriend, but there's these two creepy guys. I feel like that's, maybe I'm taking it too far, but it seems like a vaguely feminist portrayal, especially in the 60s, to kind of portray that cultural understanding that she has to be with a man or something. So
yeah,
that's interesting.
Yeah,
I would agree.
You can also take the Marxist perspective.
I would say that even to have a character in the early 60s, a female character that's sort of not interested in having a boyfriend or being around people at all, I'd say that's, to a certain extent, quite feminist, because especially in the early 60s, sort of the idea is that, okay, dear, well, you're gonna get a husband and settle down and look after the house, and to have her just say, nah, I'm not interested in doing that, I think is at least a little forward thinking for a film from this time. Now, Mitchell, you mentioned the score to this film earlier, and how it's entirely played on organ. So I do want to ask, what did you guys think of the organ score to this movie by Gene Moore? Did you think it added to the film? Did it take you out of it? What were your thoughts?
I had to warm up to it earlier on, definitely, because I was earlier on you don't really know what her... Actually, when she started playing the organ, I was like, oh, it's because she was in that crash, like something is off about her now, which is kind of true. Yeah. But that wasn't the reason why there was so much organ. I was like, oh, okay, like halfway into the movie, they kept playing it. I was like, okay, I'm starting to get the nuance for it and why they were integrating it. And then it really worked for me towards the end with the carnival thing. So it takes something to get warming up to, and you don't really necessarily need to like organ music to warm up to it. I'm not a fan, I guess, but yeah, I mean, it really worked. I think there was a lot of horror films afterwards that kind of took that and really tried to make it like an iconic horror thing where, oh, there's like a ghost playing an organ, or like there's this movie, Ghost and Mr. Chicken, which comes out like within the night. You've seen that?
Yes, I've seen the Ghost.
We watch that every Halloween. We should watch that with Don Knotts. That is one of my favorite movies of all time, and one of my family's favorite movies of all time. But anyway, The Organ Loft. But yeah, a lot of films take that and really try to push it, and I would not be surprised if this movie is the reason for that. But it's not only just like the horror moments, but it's also like the happy moments and when Mr. Linden's trying to be really sleazy and stuff, they kind of play like semi-creepy, semi-romantic, so it kind of adds like a creepy air to everything, even if it's not necessarily supposed to be. Like the audience member automatically kind of goes to that part of their brain where they're like, this is a creepy moment, so it kind of adds some ambiguity and it also just adds a lot more to the atmosphere, especially when the frightening moments are actually happening.
Yeah, I like the music in and of itself, and I like the idea that a movie score or soundtrack that is being played to the audience is also being played to the characters in the setting that the characters are in.
Yeah.
Like, to me, that is always an interesting idea. The flip side of that, though, is that since a lot of the time there was music that was the case, it also felt like there was a lot of dead air whenever there wasn't music playing.
Mm-hmm.
And like, given the parts where she's shopping for clothes or other transitional moments, it's just kind of like nothing sound wise is going on.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe that's just because there wasn't much soundtrack to work with, or it wasn't necessarily a dramatic moment that called for a specific piece, which is fine.
Mm-hmm.
But I still think that sound limitation kind of, at the very least, it makes the viewer less attentive, or it makes it harder to pay attention to what's going on in front of you. You have to invest more effort into it, which is fine, but it is something worth acknowledging, I think.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I would say I really like this score, kind of for the reasons that you mentioned, Christian. I like the fact that our lead character is an organ player, and for reasons that we'll elaborate on later, we kind of find out that this whole movie is sort of comparable to, like, a dream that she's having, in a way. And I think it therefore makes sense that the organ would be the predominant musical instrument on the soundtrack, because as an organ player, she'd probably have little bits of organ kind of in her head, and she'd be thinking of that all the time, and sort of her swells of thought could be comparable to kind of the organ coming in. And I also think that the organ is sort of an unusual instrument, and that you hear it a lot in, like, churches and at, like, Gothic historical venues, but it's not really an instrument you hear a lot on actual, like, soundtracks. I mean, sometimes if a band wants to be experimental, they'll bring in the organ, but it's not like every band says, like, okay, guys, we got our guitarist, our drummer, and our organist. The band is complete. It's kind of an unusual instrument. You don't tend to hear that often. So I think having the organ on the soundtrack as the main instrument kind of gives the whole movie this sort of otherworldly, bizarre feel that puts you on edge to at least a certain extent. I have not heard a soundtrack anywhere similar to this since I first watched this movie a couple years ago. Sometimes there's some organ on a soundtrack, but it's not usually the whole soundtrack. So I think this movie kind of stands out in that regard. Now, as I ask with every horror film we watch on this show, I want to address the big red button issue for horror movies. Did you guys find this film frightening in any way? And if you did not, could you understand why somebody else might find it frightening?
Well, I would say that if Zach sees something, it's like he'd be like, "That is frightening," and he wouldn't actually react most of the time. He'd be staring at it and squint, and he'd be like, "You know, that may have just been frightening. You know, I'm just gonna write that down. I'm gonna use that as an idea later."
Yeah.
But yes, I did think some of the scenes were not only frightening for the time, but I genuinely thought that they were actually horrific or frightening. Not really horrific, but spooky. Spooky is a good
word.
Adjective.
Yeah.
Yeah, the atmosphere was very creepy and spooky, and the score assists greatly with that. But also the cinematography really helps with that as well. But yes, the man is genuinely frightening, and he's kind of frightening. Not like I knew. There's a lot of this movie is very expected, obviously, because a lot of what's done in this movie has been done a gazillion times in decades afterwards, which is a very good thing, because you can't go very much farther back seeing similar things that are in this movie. Hence why it's a cult classic. But yeah, no, there were some scenes like when the man shows up that were frightening in the fact that his expression was perfectly timed, where he's kind of like stern and then he kind of smiles, or his eyes widen, or sometimes when he's just stern and then she freaks out, Mary Henry freaks out. And that's good, and I think that was very well timed. I think timing is very important with things like that, especially when you're dealing with so little, and you're also dealing with very little buildup. You kind of have to rely on a very little bit of tension that's present throughout the whole movie, and also not to the point where it's like 0% tension, 100% tension, because then that would be more like a jump scare. There are kind of, I guess, what you could call jump scares, like towards the beginning, but especially towards the end, there's none. I don't think there's any, pretty much. And there's just very few sequences where she's reacting very realistically, and there's multiple, I guess, carnival guests. And that part is also very troubling and disturbing. And yeah, those are generally my favorite moments. I think most of the time when the man shows up, it's pretty realistic. Obviously, there's some times where it's just like, oh, there he is again. Yeah. There he is at the window. Like I've never, you never seen that before. And my experience with it kind of overtakes the fright that I would get from it if I had seen it for the first time. Mm-hmm. But overall, very good, and especially for the time, is very, very notably good and frightening in a lot of ways.
All right. Christian, what did you think?
I mean, I basically agree with a lot of what Mitchell said, but I was never really frightened. I never was scared at what I was witnessing on the screen, but I don't know. And I think part of my frustration with the spooky stuff is I didn't understand it, which I guess to some people makes it more frightening, but to me, it being something that wasn't genuinely scary to me, but more of a, like Mitchell said, I can write this thing down as something that could be seen as scary. Like it's a much more clerical approach than an emotional one, for me at least. And so because of that, I think I expected more in the way of understanding what this threat actually is to help me feel any sort of fear towards it. And I didn't really get that. I didn't really understand what the Carnival of Souls is or what it's supposed to be. It's just kind of like these pale people that are spooky, and she and Mary Henry is like in between this world and the real world, and it's like a lot of interesting ideas that I don't think are really clarified well to the audience. And because I wasn't frightened enough by the way those ideas were presented, that frustrated me and affected my rating.
I'll make two good comparisons to help support against Christian's opinion, because he's totally wrong. I'm just kidding.
Okay. Thank you.
No, that's a perfectly valid perspective, especially from today. That's a very valid perspective, and I totally understand that. But two things I would mention is Twilight Zone.
Yes. Which
this is very much in the terms of the psychedelic type of things.
Absolutely.
Are Twilight Zone, definitely. This would be a very frightening Twilight Zone, like probably one of the most frightening.
If they
Twilight
condense
Zones,
this and put it in half an hour, absolutely a Twilight Zone episode, yeah.
Mm-hmm. And then the other thing I would mention is a more recent thing. I think 1999, Blair Witch Project, which was also very low budget. In fact, I think lower budget than this. Mm-hmm. You don't know what the antagonist is at all the entire time. You don't even know towards the end. You only get bits and pieces from pseudo documentary interviews in the beginning. Yeah. And they're like, oh, we don't really know what this is. We heard kids screaming, getting taken away, and that's pretty much all you get. And it's like a very realistic perspective. Like, you don't know what this thing is, and it makes it a very realistic thing. But I would say it's kind of just a matter of preference, because some people prefer horror where it's in your face and you know everything about the antagonist, and what you know about it is very appealing to you, or you know a lot about the antagonist, like personally, then that can definitely scare you. You can also go the other direction where it's a lot more universal, or could be more universally felt. At least that's the intention, where it's a very unknown antagonist and you don't know virtually anything about the antagonist the entire time. And fear of the unknown is one of the greatest fears. So that is, it's just another perspective. But I mean, it's really just a matter of preference. Like, some people, like Christian, enjoy stuff like that's much more, personal, and you can be much more invested in it. And that's kind of what is more frightening. And in another way, it could also be you don't know anything, and just not knowing and then suddenly seeing bits and pieces of it is what's frightening to you.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't necessarily mind that approach. I think the reason that it bothered me in this case is that those bits and pieces weren't genuinely frightening to me on their own.
Mm-hmm. I can definitely see that. Like Mitchell said, I would agree. The way I am basically never frightened by horror movies anymore. I've kind of burnt out the ability to be scared in my own mind, except for some very rare exceptions, because I've seen so many horror movies at this point. So I think a lot of this movie for me is definitely kind of taking note of, that's a nice visual. That's pretty creepy. There are some scenes in this, I think, that do that are very creepy, though. There's nothing in this that's going to make you go, oh, my soul! But, there's some great moments that I think send a shiver up your spine. The best of them, I think, being there's a scene where Mary is driving to Utah in total darkness. She's on the way to the little town where she's got her new job, and it's absolutely dark, and she's on a back road, and she turns to the side, and through the car window, she sees the man staring back at her. And I think that's a great, creepy visual. Every time that I'm on, like, a dark road at night, I always think about that, and how creepy and strange that potential visual and concept is, because it goes so against what your brain knows is possible. And I think there are a lot of other moments in the film that work along that similar line. Kind of tying into the idea of you having to interpret this film and not being given everything. I think this movie does a great job at replicating the feel of a dream. Because when you're dreaming, often things aren't spelled out. You might just be, I'm being pursued by this weird pale man, and he creeps me out for some reason that I can't really explain. I'm compelled to go towards this location, and I can't tell why. I'm wandering around an empty carnival, and I have absolutely no idea why I'm there. I think this movie does a great job of kind of replicating those nightmares that we all have, that we're weirded out by and creeped out by, and we can't exactly say why. Even though the visuals from this movie might not be especially scary, I think they definitely stick in your head. I first watched this movie 6 years ago, and I turned it off at the end, and I thought, okay, that was a movie. But I can remember first watching, the scene in the carnival with all the spirits spinning around. I remember the scene where they're chasing her down to the beach and they all kind of pile on top of her. The scene in the car, the scene in the psychiatrist's office where the chair turns around and it's the man sitting there instead of her doctor. I think those are visuals that really stick in your head and stay with you, even if they don't necessarily freak you out while you're watching the movie itself. Yeah. That's my personal perspective on it, at least I would say. I think, going with what Mitchell said, I think this movie plays on the idea that what you don't know is often a lot scarier than what you do. Because I think if the movie ended with the man walking up to Mary and going, "You see, Mary, I am a ghost, and I am here to bring you back to..." Like, if they explained everything, I think it would come across as even more hokey and dated. So I think that restraint to let the audience figure things out for themselves, or try to figure things out for themselves, is really to be admired. And that's something I really appreciate, as anybody who has seen any of my films could probably assume. To take it on down to the ending, as we already mentioned, this movie, like Mitchell mentioned, has an ending quite reminiscent of The Sixth Sense. Basically, at the end of the movie, we learn that Mary Henry this whole time has been a ghost. She's been dead. And she died in that car crash at the beginning of the film and has been underwater this whole time. And it's just been her spirit walking about. So what did you guys think of the ending? Did that twist surprise you? Did you find it predictable? What did you think of it?
I definitely thought it was predictable.
Really?
And the only reason why,
Mm-hmm.
because I can't look at this objectively and say that I wouldn't have expected it.
Yeah.
Because especially when I knew instantly, right when she was walking around and nobody saw her,
Really?
and she was completely deaf.
Mm-hmm.
And after that, I was like, okay, this is definitely gonna be like The Sixth Sense, and I have that kind of like intuition. But I mean, I don't know. It was expected, but it didn't hurt how I liked the movie at all, and the way that they approached it, especially for that time. I mean, that was like very well done. And in terms of if I had not expected it, that would have been a great twist.
Mm-hmm.
So I mean, there's nothing the movie could have done to prevent that, I don't think. But yeah, I really liked it. I see the restrictions that they had with writing and kind of having, good enough actors and actresses and having like a well-developed story to the point where they would be able to accomplish something like The Sixth Sense,
Mm-hmm.
where it was like the main character actually thought everyone was hearing him the entire time.
Yeah.
That is a much more effective twist in concept. But I think the way that this movie approached it, and that it was kind of taking an alternate approach and giving I guess I have to use the same idiom or however you call it again, bits and pieces throughout the whole film that were kind of like, oh, okay, well, now she's kind of experiencing this. This is kind of weird. She's having visions. Mm-hmm. Now she's kind of like walking around and nobody's hearing her and she can't hear anything. And the car almost hits her and you're like, okay, now it's normal. Now everybody can hear her again. And you're like, well, that's a little strange. Like, what are they really going for? You're not 100% sure. So that's another way of approaching it, I guess. In my opinion, I think it's a lot less effective than The Sixth Sense, but, I mean, we are talking about the 60s, so I will give it much leniency considering the time that this was, this came out. So I think it's a very imaginative idea, and I think, coming to the very end and having, like, when you're, like, very surprised, like, oh, my gosh, there's, like, the police officers and, like, the tracks end there, and then you slowly start to figure it out. Then you're like, oh, they're pulling the car out, and you're like, no way, is the girl going to be there? Oh my God, she's there. And that's how it was supposed to end. And I think that in concept is a very good thing. There's a lot of potential there. And I think, once again, with a bigger budget and, maybe a lot better actors, I think that could have been accomplished a lot, more succinctly and would have been a lot more convincing earlier on.
Mm-hmm. Okay, yeah, definitely. Christian, what did you think?
I mean, I didn't anticipate that twist, but it did frustrate me, especially given the chronology of events. Like, it didn't really click with me. I didn't even realize that that's what that meant at first when they discovered the car. Mm-hmm. And I mean, given that she sort of goes in and out of that no one can hear me and I can't hear them type thing, It confused me and left me dissatisfied, honestly. I didn't think that the twist... I thought that was a strong choice, and again, it's an interesting idea, but I kind of agree that The Sixth Sense makes it work in a way that the audience can accept a lot easier. Mm-hmm. And just given the way that she goes in and out of that state and interacts like a normal human being does, it left me more frustrated, and it felt like an incomplete decision to me, but I don't know.
Okay. I would say, I remember the ending very clearly from when I first saw this film. This most recent rewatch, of course, the twist didn't surprise me because I remember the twist. But when I first saw the film, I do remember that ending being a case of, wait, she was dead? Like, it really did take me by surprise. And I do like the fact that there's not necessarily... At the end of The Sixth Sense, when we learn that he's dead, sorry to anybody who's not seen The Sixth Sense, but it has been out for 21 years. When we do learn at the end of The Sixth Sense that he's dead, we kind of get these flashbacks or these individual visuals to explain, like, and here's how he thought he was interacting with somebody, and here's how he also thought he was interacting with somebody. It sort of explains things in retrospect. And I like that this movie doesn't really do that. Once again, for the sake of interpretation, I like that this movie almost ends like it's a jigsaw puzzle and it's putting one of the last pieces in. And there's like 4 pieces left missing across the entire puzzle that are pretty easy to put in, but the audience has to figure it out for themselves and has to actively think about the film in order to think, okay, well, maybe the dream sequences where she sees the man are like death reaching out to her and trying to pull her towards death. And it makes you think about the film more and come up with your own theories and interpretations, which I love in films. I'm a big fan of films that don't hand you everything. So I do like this ending a lot, and I remember being surprised by it when I first watched it. Were audiences in 1962 surprised? I don't know. I imagine they probably would be, because the character's been dead the whole time. Wasn't necessarily a big trope already in the 60s, but... Christian, did you
I don't necessarily need the whole recap handed to me after we learn the twist. I just need it to make sense retrospectively, and to me it did not make sense retrospectively, given the events that are portrayed on screen, for her to have been dead the entire time.
And it's a pretty easy scapegoat just to say she was just dreaming, or like it was just an imaginative thing the entire time. You know what I mean? Like, I mean that's what I think it relies on.
Well, I think this is where the interpretation thing comes in, because Mitchell, you seem to have seen it as her dreaming. I see it as she's been a ghost this whole time that hasn't known that she's dead. There's lots of stories and real-life accounts of people that have interacted with ghosts, that talked with them and walked with them and acted like real people. So I don't think it's, something that doesn't make sense for her to interact normally with people and phase in and out as she sort of discovers that she's a ghost. But I guess that's kind of where the interpretation aspect comes in. I interpret that as making perfect sense, the way that I see the film. Christian, you don't, and Mitchell, you seem to have a totally different thought on what it might have been in the first place. So I think
I knew she was dead. I was gonna say I do think she was dead the whole time, but I think like I should have said it's more like it's like her visions.
Mm-hmm.
She's having visions because she's like going in and out of the real world, and she's like in like the space between being alive and being dead.
Yes.
And the carnival's basically hell, and like the man is death. So that's the symbolism that I interpreted.
Yeah, that's great. I mean, we're talking about symbolism and visuals, and I think that's the beauty of a film like this, is that I can see it one way, you can see it the other, and Christian can be dissatisfied by seeing it a totally different way. I think that's what's great about this type of movie, and that's what I love in art cinema. So that pretty much brings us to the end of my discussion notes, but do we have any final thoughts on Carnival of Souls before we hand it over to Christian for his segment?
2 out of 5. I definitely liked the Abominable Dr. Phibes more. I think that's just my sort of horror subgenre that suits me more. Even though I would not say I'm a horror buff by any means, but Zach is getting me there closer and closer every week. So yeah, it was fine, I guess. I don't know. I guess it just wasn't for me, but I don't think it was terrible. Our protagonist is good. Watch it if you like horror. Don't watch it if you don't.
All right.
Yeah, 3 out of 5, gang. Yeah, Zach, high five.
Hey.
I really did like this film. I think it is, if anything, a very, very well thought out and very high potential horror movie for its time and beyond its time in its ideas. And despite some of the execution being responsible, or having some of the execution being because of a lack of a budget and kind of where it comes from, where are the filmmakers from? I think isn't this from like the Midwest or something?
Lawrence, Kansas. It's in the middle of nowhere.
There we go, middle of nowhere horror movie. But it's like Zach had said in his review, if you have big ideas and you have a good, solid, imagination, you can come up with very good stories. And as long as you portray the very bare bones horror aspects, the things that are required in a horror movie a lot of the time that make it genuinely frightening, then I think you can come up with something that's pretty good. This movie should never be remade ever. I think it already was remade. Unfortunately, I'm not even going to try it. But there is a lot of influence that maybe a lot of Hitchcockian influence, I think, in this, and that's pretty much all I can think of. And Twilight Zone, and then afterward, obviously, Romero and David Lynch.
Yeah.
So this is a very important movie. I don't necessarily recommend it if you're not into a lot of the tropes that are associated with 60s movies, but if you really appreciate horror as a creative genre where a lot of different things can be derived and a lot of different things can be expected, then I think this is a very good film. I think I could pretty much say that it's pretty necessary for anybody who is interested in the horror genre and wants to learn about origin stories and things like that. But yeah, 3 out of 5, pretty good. Acting not that good, but overall, a very, very solid horror movie and beyond its time.
Yeah, Mitchell, I think you've hit the nail on the head. I think this is a great cult classic. If you're into horror, I think you have to watch this. You might not necessarily like it, but I think you should give it a chance, because I think there are a lot of concepts in this that really have influenced horror in general, and I think this movie hasn't dated as badly as you would expect it to, given its extremely low budget and the time that it was made. So yeah, if you're interested, definitely give it a shot. And now I will hand the reins to Christian.
It is time for the rundown.
In organ music.
Yes.
1 minute. We say things about the movie we just discussed at Zach, and he will respond with a rating out of 5. Mitchell, are you ready?
Yeah.
All right. 3, 2, 1, go.
The old ritzy bathhouse.
4 out of 5.
Taking intellect and soul to be a musician.
3 out of 5.
An organist capable of stirring the soul.
4 out of 5.
Being paler than Zach Garrigus.
5 out of 5.
Minister car rides.
4 out of 5.
Thanking someone and never going back.
2 out of 5.
Old houses creaking worse than one's knees.
3 out of 5.
Mary's aesthetic.
3 out of 5.
Classes, things, principal products, girls.
3 out of 5.
Girls that are, quote, off their knocker.
2 out of 5.
Making good money as an ordinary warehouse guy.
3 out of 5.
Claiming that one cannot live in isolation from the human race.
2 out of 5.
Seeing a church as a place of business.
2 out of 5.
Black and white.
4 out of 5.
Frances Feist as Mrs. Thomas.
4 out of 5.
A 78-minute runtime. 1 second.
3 out of 5.
And we're out of time. Oh, so sad.
What a shame.
We had a lot to go on that one. Oh, well.
We did. Yeah.
Those were good ones.
Yeah. Wow, we got our first 5 out of 5 on the rundown.
We did.
Huzzah.
I was expecting it. I knew it.
It took something really special to get that 5 out of 5. Well, as we wrap up episode 14 of Cookie Pocket, an attempt at a podcast, I'm going to hand it over to Mitchell to introduce us to next episode's film.
No Country for Old Men.
All right.
Javier Bardem. Older white people.
Okay.
That's it. Police. Midwest. Death. That's it.
Yeah.
That's all I want to say.
That's
great.
Those are some
Very good
great-
movie.
Yeah. Those are some great buzzwords for that film. And I'm looking forward to talking about it. But until then, we have been Cookie Pocket, an attempt at a podcast. Goodbye.